All right, students, I'm here to talk to you about the extension activity this week, which is a comparison of autocracy and oligarchy. We're going to look at two examples from the Soviet Union. So now that you have this theoretical understanding of oligarchy, we're going to look at Stalin and Khrushchev, leaders of the Soviet Union, and look at what aspects of their rule, right, as leaders, were they autocratic or oligarchic, and which way do you think they leaned a little bit more towards? Let's get started. So we have some kind of basic underlying principles or features that we can talk about with autocracy and oligarchy. I tried to kind of break it down into real simple theoretical or pure ideas. So with autocracy, we know that a single ruler with absolute power, and that ruler is either born into that power or claims divine right. Right? We talked about theocracy as part of that. And then common people don't have a say in the government unless the autocrat says so. The features are similar in oligarchy, except it has to do with a small group. And the small group will also hold all the power. In addition, that small group has the right to rule through status. They were born into it, just like we talked about with autocracy and a hereditary lineage that transfers power. Or one feature about oligarchy that's interesting that we see a lot is plutocracy, or the idea of wealth. And so this idea of people have accumulated a lot of wealth, end up getting a lot of power, and then common people don't have a say in the government unless the small group says so. All right, we know these essential concepts. We went over them in the last slide. Just to remind you, elite, the official and unofficial aspects of an oligarchy, and aristocracy or plutocracy, as we just mentioned, and then the systems that they're not inherent, but many times an oligarchy can be embedded within them. So a capitalist economic system can many times have leaders that are, that receive the power through their wealth. And then communism will have a small group in many cases that are running the whole show, or socialism can also dive into that too, as community or local government or federal government power becomes more prevalent. We're going to do a very brief overview. There's a lot more to the Soviet Union than what I'm giving you, but I do want to try to give you an understanding a little bit about the history so you can get some context. So there was a monarchy in Russia that was overthrown in 1921 through civil war, and it established the Soviet Union. This is the world's first Marxist communist state. It became one of the biggest and most powerful nations in the world. It occupied nearly 1/6 of Earth's land surface, really big, and it actually dissolved in 1991, and it was called the USSR. Made of 15 republics: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. All right, let's look a little bit about the history as it's related to the Soviet Union. It had its origins in the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Tsar at the time, the monarch at the time, was overthrown, and the Bolsheviks, which was the Communist Party, established a state. Okay, it was a long, bloody civil war. As you can see, it was over 4 years long. But there was even a power vacuum a little bit after that too, which we'll talk about. They defeated the White Army, which was a different party that was also trying to get power at the time. And they were monarchist, capitalists, and supporters of socialism. And then there was mass executions. against supporters of the Tsarist regime among the Bolsheviks when they were trying to get power. A treaty was formed to establish the Soviet Union with the first initial countries of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Vladimir Lenin took over the initial republic, and then it became to grow to 15 nations. A series of reforms were initiated to abolish private property, collectivize agriculture, and increase industry under the communist regime. They were also efforts to increase military and arms, and they increased further as World War II encroached and went to the Eastern Front, and the Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses of World War II. It's important to think about this and know this, that over 24 million civilian and military deaths happened in the Soviet Union as a result of the war, and over 10 million of those were military deaths. So they lost a huge degree of troops and civilians during the war. There's a lot of context around that, but we're going to save that for another time. Through this, really, a division started to happen after World War II between a philosophical division, right, between the East and the West. And it presented itself in a term called the Iron Curtain. And it was between Western European countries and the United States and Soviet-controlled Eastern European countries. People could not pass freely between the borders of these two governments, and the communists also set up a system of puppet governments within all their 15 states, and they were really controlled by the central authority of the Communist Party. For many years, World War II, the members of NATO, this was the Western Alliance of Nations, refused to trade. So not only was it political, but it was also economic. And through that, a term, the Cold War, was coined. And this was also part of this war was the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Both the Soviet Union, the United States, and European powers had nuclear capabilities. This caused a lot of tension between both of these two states, or both of these two ideologies, and the Soviet Union was worried about invasion. At the same time, the United States and Western Europe was worried about the spread of communism in the Soviet Union. Not only the Soviet Union, right, but also the Republic of China, Vietnam. We know a lot about these tensions historically. We're going to look at two leaders. They're the first two leaders of the Republic. We do see this timeline has Alexander Kerensky, but really Lenin was the first true leader of the Republic, but Stalin really was Lenin was only a leader for not for very long, for a couple of years. He died in 1924. Stalin really took over as the leader, and then Khrushchev was the second leader. So we're going to talk about both of these leaders, and were they more autocratic, were they more oligarchic, how did they run their republic. Please set up a T-chart. On one side you're going to want Stalin, on the other side you're going to want Khrushchev. Let's look, you don't have to take a ton of notes on this, but let's just kind of get a sense of where did Stalin come from, how did he gain power. He ruled from 1928 to 1953, so 25 years. He was actually in leadership roles before that, but he was premier, is what they would call the leader of the Soviet Union. He was the premier from that time. He was born in Georgia, not the U.S. state, the country. He was very poor as a child. He's the son of a shoemaker. His father was actually an alcoholic and abusive, so he had a very rough upbringing. He began to learn about communism and got really interested in it and was super inspired by Karl Marx's Communist manifesto. He ended up joining the militant wing of the Bolshevik Party under Lenin, and he became a political agitator. He started to participate and be involved in strikes and labor demonstrations. Additionally, he engaged in criminal activities. He robbed banks. He did a variety of criminal activities to fund the politics and to fund the movement. He was arrested multiple times between 1902 and 1913. He was even imprisoned in Siberia during that time. And he moved up through the Bolshevik Party ladder until he was appointed Secretary General in the newly formed Soviet Union under Lenin. But after Lenin's death, Stalin was not only shrewd in politics, but also he was also pretty ruthless. And he outmaneuvered his rivals. He surrounded himself with people who he supported. He consolidated his power, and he became the undisputed leader of the Communist Party. In some ways, much to the shock of many of his colleagues, he really was able to grab things, and he was really ruthless in doing that. His legacy. Okay, just like any legacy of any leader, these things can be very controversial. But let's first look at some of the things he did. He consolidated his power. He initiated what's called the Great Purge, where he arrested, imprisoned, and killed political rivals. And we're talking about millions of people. He kept a small circle of political advisors who had limited voice in decision making. He did have a circle of advisors that would inform him of things and help him make decisions, but he ultimately had a lot of the voice in what was happening. He centralized the government and bureaucratic power under the Communist Party. He increased ministries, legislative bodies, trade unions, political police, armed forces, and he initiated a series of reforms to transform the Soviet Union from a peasant to agricultural society. So it was a pretty, let's say, a very agrarian society, not very developed when he took power. So he did a number of things. First, he collectivized agriculture. He took control of all the land and the farms, put it under government control in order to try to take that wealth and channel it into industrialization in order to strengthen the economy, urbanize the population, and establish Russia and the Soviet Union as a world power. Okay, he led mass efforts for defeating the Nazis to the west and the Japanese to the east. So he was able to secure his borders. It was a bloody, as I said, lots of lots of people in the Soviet Union died under his regime. But in order to, part of that, protecting their border in World War II, he was, in the forefront of securing a nuclear weapon to set us not only through industry, but to set the Soviet Union on the world stage. And he carried out a number of initiatives to halt any opposition to his authority. As part of his policies, right, farmers, millions were killed or imprisoned. This caused a decline in output and mass starvation known as the Great Famine. The Gulag system he established, these were forced labor camps. He used those to increase production, imprison his political rivals, and millions also died in these camps. And fear and terror were widespread during Stalin's time. He's responsible for the death of up to 20 million of his own people during his rule. So that's part of his legacy. So thinking about that, think about him as, was he more autocratic? Was he more oligarchic? And what were some of his accomplishments? And some of his, some of these really terrible things that happened during his rule. We're going to move on to Khrushchev, but I'm going to have to make a new video for that. So I'll start the new video at Khrushchev. See you in a minute.